Welcome to The General and the Journalist. I'm Patrick Sanders, the general part of the equation.
And I'm the journalist, Tom Newton-Dunn. And last week on the podcast, we talked about China's military might, just how strong the People's Liberation Army is today, and who'd prevail in a top Trump-style confrontation now between China and the US. The answer seems to be pretty much dependent on where that fight might happen, as our guest, the former CIA analyst Tim Heath, somewhat brilliantly explained to us. This week, though, in part two of our look at China's power, we want to talk about its non-military means, how Beijing might want to dominate the West economically. The new front line is how much China controls the world's manufacturing supply chains. And it's not just about who makes the component parts for all our consumer goods or iPhones anymore. Our militaries are ever more reliant on them now as well. And all that means it might not be who'd win in a toe-to-toe conflict, but whether the West could fight China at all. And that is something that Western policymakers just haven't yet or won't wake up to.
Well, that's the view of Sam Olsen. Sam, who's joining us today, served in Iraq as a military intelligence officer under General Sir Nick Carter, who was on the podcast just a few weeks ago. He worked in the Senate and for the White House and is now a leading geopolitical strategist who's paid a particularly close interest to China for the past 30 years. And you can read his work and listen to his podcast, States of Play, on Substack. I do every week, and it's full of brilliant insight and analysis. Anyway, welcome, Sam. We asked Tim Heath the same question last week. How on earth did you become a China hand?
Very good question. But basically, my family's been in Asia for generations, and when I was young, I used to joke I was the only kid growing up in South Leicestershire with Chinese furniture, and so we just, as a family, we just talked about China all the time. And when I was a young man, just at university, I was offered a chance to go and work in Hong Kong with the army, part of the Hong Kong garrison there, just before handover. And went to China first proper in 1996, and just fell in love with the place. I think it's a wonderful country. The people are great for the most part. The food's great, and there's so much history. And the thing about China is that it is also the number one geopolitical player. So with a natural love for the country, but also understanding how geopolitics is playing out and its role, I think that there's no other place to look at the moment other than China.
So I think your judgment has been considerably wiser than mine. I encourage my son to read Russian and study Russian at school rather than Chinese, and I think you made the rather wiser choice than he did. Anyway, let's get into the meat of this. So we're going to talk about exactly what Western military kit and components in terms of supply chains. But before we do that, I just want to set the scene. And the scene I think that we want to set is around Xi Jinping's goals for the rejuvenation of China. Now, you'll have read everything that pretty much former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd has said. But in one of his books, he said that President Xi's ideological canon is vastly different from the 35 years of economic and foreign policy pragmatism of his three predecessors, Deng Xiaoping, Yang Zemin, and Hu Jintao. So can you just sketch out what is Xi's ideology and what's his vision for China?
That's a really good but very deep question, because there's a lot of philosophy on that, which I won't go into. But in effect, I think it is slightly misjudging it to say that there was a massive change in Chinese policy when she took over until 2012, 2013, 2014, and that period of adjustment into the world we see now. Because there has always been a desire / a demand by the Chinese Communist Party to be dominant in that part of the world. The move to become a global power certainly more recent in the last 2 decades. But if you look at, for example, Deng Xiaoping, who was a former leader especially in the 80s and really kickstarted China's economic miracle, he said in the early 90s, towards the end of his tenure, that Saudi Arabia has oil, we have rare earths. And we'll probably talk about rare earths when we talk about the exposure the UK and the West has to China. But this was very much joined up strategic thinking about how China could create a position of dominance over the supply chains and the manufacturing base of the world as a lever toward political dominance, or at least political power. The difference is that Deng Xiaoping and his immediate successors used the term bide and hide, which is basically biding their time and hiding their true intentions. And it was only under Xi Jinping in the 2010s, in the teens, where that hide and bide mantra was shelved. And actually, there was a decision, an active decision taken that now was China's time to go for it. And a big part of that was taking advantage of the declining American fortunes, which particularly kicked in around 2007 and 8 in the great financial crisis. But I think, in summary, China is now where it's wanted to be for a long time, but it is only in the last 10 or so years that China's felt that it can actually make that move towards regional, if not global dominance.
And okay, so that's fascinating, and I rather like the characterization. I mean, the one that always sticks in my mind, and I don't know who said it, was Mao made China stand up, Deng made China rich, and Xi wants to make China great. I mean, do you think that's a very simplistic view, or does that kind of get the the the, the tone of each of those leaders have done?
Well, it's a pithy view, but often pithy views can be the most accurate, and I think there's probably a lot to that. I think what's really important, though, is that we cannot look at China in isolation. What has been going on is in the rest of the world is that we have seen the peak of American power in probably I personally say in about 2001, 2002, and a lot of people would agree with that, and that was just before the Iraq invasion. And since then, though, you have seen a decline in relative American power militarily to a degree, but especially economically and politically, and the hollowing out of American values and the rules-based order that it was very much instrumental in bringing in after the Second World War, thanks to the maneuvers by, first of all, Wilson after the First World War, but also especially Roosevelt, who really envisaged a post-World War order dominated by America. But in the last 20, 25 years, that world order has been hollowed out, and China is taking advantage to really push its own agenda and to create a world order which is very different to the one that we've known all our lives.
So back to the question I asked you to begin with, Xi's vision for China, and you've sort of helped me understand how, which of those key leaders played a role. But what is the Chinese dream, and what is when we talk about Chinese, when Xi talks about Chinese rejuvenation, what does he mean?
Well, the most important part of that is the re part of the rejuvenation. Because a big part of the Chinese Communist Party's mantra is that we will restore China's greatness. And what that presupposes is that before the century of humiliation, which started in the 1840s and 50s when Britain went to war with China in the Opium Wars, and then you had a period of carving up China into different spheres of influence under the different European powers, including Russia, of course. That century of humiliation, which only ended in 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party took power, is something that the CCP has continually used as an opportunity to cement its own power internally and to be able to provide a narrative for its people to say that we will get us back to where we were. And if we have that in mind, then the Chinese dream is basically helping Chinese people at the individual level to make a commitment to becoming part of the rejuvenation story at the national and international level.
I was we were doing a little bit of reading to try and get my head into this. I came across a speech that Xi gave in 2015 at a dinner in Washington State, where he describes his experiences as a young man. I think it was during the Cultural Revolution, and then in a village, and then he returned to it, and it was a sort of it was a very inspiring story of how China had fundamentally transformed. Um, when you talk in your writing about the Chinese dream, do you think that speech is kind of captures what he's after?
Yes, I do. And actually, I was happened to be in Shanghai when the Chinese Dream announcement happened, and I remember having lunch with my colleagues, Chinese colleagues, and they were very gung ho about it. And it's not hard to see why, because the fact is that the way that the CCP has changed China is unbelievably dramatic. It's world definingly dramatic. There has been 700, 800 million, however you define it, of people who've been brought out of poverty. And it is such a common story when you travel through China to meet someone who say, oh yes, my grandfather used to work on the paddy fields until he was 90 or 95, whatever. And now look at me, I'm an engineer earning $200,000 a year.
And one of the component parts of this strategy, maybe one of the central pillars of it, is to achieve domination of the tech sector, but in particular to be to achieve lead status in adoption of an exploitation of the fourth industrial revolution, and in particular harnessing artificial intelligence. And I think you've written about how the Chinese have looked at what the impact was for the UK by harnessing the first industrial revolution. How much is that a critical part of their strategy? And do you think that, I mean, where do they, how are they doing? How would you mark their scorecard?
Personally, if I was going to reduce China's overall ambition to one, use that word again, pithy line, I would say to win the fourth industrial revolution, because it just ticks all the boxes that it needs. We look at rejuvenation. Well, we look at the British and the American examples of winning the first, second, and third. What that did was to give them huge economic power, which they then used to create political power, which then allowed them to recreate the world in their own images. I mean, the last 300 years has really been a story of Anglo-American dominance of the world. And if you then say, okay, what does China want? The CCP wants to remain in power, definitely. And they also want to make sure that China is a great country, again, as we said. And that political and economic power together, what better way to do it than the fourth industrial revolution, which is on the way? And if they don't win it, America will win it. So that will mean that they can't compete against America moving forward.
Just to explain, just in case people aren't familiar with the term, what exactly do you mean by the fourth industrial revolution?
Okay, good question. So the first industrial revolution, which is 1700s and early 1800s, was steam. That's basically using steam to drive machines. The second and third were all about computers and information technologies, and the fourth is, it sounds a bit banal and a bit mundane, but it is about using advanced manufacturing to create economic power. What that means in reality, though, is harnessing all the new technologies that we've got to be able to create this new behemoth in terms of an approach to manufacturing. And that means being the number one country for AI, which is AI is completely underpinning all of the other parts. So what those other parts are? Robotics, biotechnology, quantum, all these new technologies that can completely revolutionize things and produce things like nuclear fusion, which can produce things like factories that operate with only two people, but can churn out things that the rest of the world wants in a day rather than waiting for 6 months. And China's long been thinking about how to take advantage of all these new technologies. And if they do win it, it will mean that they are cementing their economic power. And again, it's economic power in the Chinese mind and in historical mind is all leading towards political power.
Sam, let's get to the heart of your argument here. Precisely how it is that China does dominate the West's military supply chain. How does it happen?
What's happened is that because they've been so successful in manufacturing and supply chain, that means that they are now able to control so much of the supply chains that we need for the military. And if we break that down, we can look at some stats which really underpin this. About a third of all the world's manufacturing happens in China. And that, to put that in perspective, is more than the US, Japan, Germany, France, Britain, Canada, Australia combined. The military industrial complex, or which we call today the technological industrial base, the TIB that all militaries rely on, especially Western militaries because they're so advanced. That is now fundamentally rooted in the manufacturing heart of the Chinese state. And there's so many examples of that. For example, rare earths, which people think, oh, they're sort of, they're not particularly important. They're massively important. Every F-35 fighter has hundreds, 400 kilograms of rare earths in it.
Sam, by rare earths, you mean precious metals?
Yes, well, actually, to be really specific about it, rare earths are specifically 17 metals. Rare earths and actual critical minerals, them together, they're both dominated by China. And the stats, just phenomenal. 90% of the world's graphite from China, 98% of the world's gallium, which is needed for military, half the world's antimony, which is needed for the military, 44% of the world's copper refined in China compared to 3% for America. At lithium, 80-90% of all the world's lithium processing done by China. It goes on and on and on. The military requirement for rare earths and almost all critical minerals is entirely dependent, or at least to a big part dependent, on China.
I guess my really big question here, and actually it's probably more one for Patrick, how could it be that the West, Britain, France, America especially, could have allowed itself to be so reliant on a potential very, very serious future enemy for so much of its military components, its military hardware? I mean, when you were Chief of General Staff but a year ago, were you aware of this? Did you see all these reports coming across your desk, and did it worry you?
Well, I mean, you got to remember where we've come from over the last 40 years, Tom. I mean, the world has embraced globalization, and globalization, which essentially ensured that we integrated our supply chains all around the world, meant that manufacturing and assembly was cheaper. And as a result of globalization, we've ended up with supply chains that are extraordinarily difficult to map. You may know where some of the major components come from. You may know where some of the subsidiary components come from, but trying to trace that supply chain back all the
Mm.
way through is incredibly hard. And we have woken up to it, and we did spend a lot of time when I was CGS in the Chiefs Committee, discussing these vulnerabilities and discussing the threat that China was increasingly viewed to pose. But the British the British government were not in the same place, and the same is probably true in the European Union and possibly in the US as well. China was seen as a vital economic partner. The idea that we would try to decouple, that we would see China as a threat, has meant that we have woken up to the threat too late.
Sam, just give us some specific examples of actual military kit, military hardware that the British Armed Forces use that if China was to flip the switch and turn it off, we couldn't use anymore.
Um, Good question. Every F-35, every ship in the Royal Navy has huge amounts of rare earths. Without them, we cannot make more. And in fact, a few years ago, I was talking to a Chinese contact, and we were talking about the discussion on can a J-20 take down a Eurofighter, the J-20 being the really advanced Chinese jets. And the Chinese friend said, well, to be honest, it doesn't really matter because the difference is that if we shoot down an F-35, you can't replace that because you need Chinese rare earths. We can replace the J-20 because we don't need you for that.
Right.
And that is an important element. There is a massive disconnect between what we're looking at in terms of our military capabilities and actually where that military capability is dependent on.
So your key point, we could fight China, but it wouldn't last very long because once they've destroyed the kit we currently have, it's irreplaceable.
All roads in the manufacturing and the supply chain world lead eventually back to China. And there's not enough being done to be able to break that control. So at the end of the day, if we did go to war with China and the Chinese decided that they wanted to cut off, which they almost certainly would, that our access to advanced manufactured goods, then that would cripple us. And if they wanted to stop us getting this stuff before they went to war, then that would obviously be a very big issue too.
Is it not just simply as simple as we need to start digging, finding our own rare earths? There's a lot around Ukraine, for example, and processing this stuff double quick time so we can have our own supply chains we can rely on.
Yes, and people are beginning to do that. In America, they're opening the first cobalt refinery plant. In Canada, they're opening a lithium refinery, and they're doing other things around Europe and the West. So, there is beginnings of a response. But what we need to talk about is the time frame. They've got a window of opportunity while they still control huge amounts of the manufacturing process, which means that they control the massive amount of the military supply chain for the West, and the time it takes for that gap to be halved. Now that will take not just 1 or 2 years; it could take literally decades.
So, Sam, I, you're describing what feels like an almost unbeatable opponent, um, and I'm gonna be slightly mischievous and accuse you of fueling Chinese cognitive warfare because the Chinese are all about fighting without winning, and part of that is convincing your opponents that there is no point in fighting because you can't possibly win. And it may be the case that everything you're saying is true, but it does sort of lead you into a sense of there's no point. If they're that dominant, if we can't win, if they dominate the supply chains, we're kind of stuck or up a certain creek without a paddle. And I just wonder how much how much inevitability there is about this, because we know that Xi is, in Kevin Rudd's language, he's a Marxist, Leninist, nationalist. We know that he's an economic Marxist. And when you look historically around, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to find a Marxist economy that has not collapsed under its own contradictions. You know, Chinese growth was driven by three things: the housing market, infrastructure, and by manufacturing. The housing market's collapsed. Infrastructure is no longer working for them. China Rail, $900 billion dollars in debt. So they're left with manufacturing. And what you're describing is a future where they become totally dominant in terms of manufacturing. They need to sustain their economy through exports. Why would they get to a position where they're threatening that economic prosperity and exports by threatening the supply chain reliance? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does, and it's something which often people discuss here, especially business people who are heavily invested in China. But let's just break that down a little bit. First of all, it is not to say, from what I've been discussing today, that China is all sweetness and light. There are huge, huge domestic problems for the Chinese. Let's look at demography. First of all, the absolute number of Chinese is shrinking. The latest estimates are that by the end of this century, China's population will have dropped from about 1.3-ish billion now to about 525 million, the biggest absolute drop in ever. And that is going to cause huge problems because that 500 plus million population is going to be dominated by old people. I can't remember the stat off the top of my head, but it's something like 100, 150 million of those will be over 60. It's something chronic. Then you have the issue around one child policy. Now, people often say, "Oh, that led to a shrinkage in the Chinese population." That's not the case. What it did do, that policy, was to massively increase the amount of female infanticide. To the extent that today, if the upper numbers are correct, which is maybe 30 to 40 million, that there are 30 to 40 million single men in China who will never find a wife. To put that in perspective, that's more men in China, more single men in China, than there are men full stop in America between the age of 20 and 60. That
Mm.
is creating huge social pressures, especially in the second and third and fourth tier Chinese cities, because there's just lots of men sitting around doing not much. And what makes it worse is that the Chinese economy is moving up the value scale. And so a lot of the jobs that kept those men employed in concrete factories or in steel factories was are disappearing. And what makes it even worse is that half of China is rural. And that rural half of China is completely uneducated. Only 10% of the rural half of China have a high school education. That
Mm.
means that them actually going up the value chain is dependent entirely on the urban half of China, which have got very good education systems. But that doesn't relate to the majority. That only relates to small amounts of the middle classes. So the Chinese government have got huge demands on them to really stop their own domestic situation collapsing, which brings me on to why this is such an important thing for the West. I call it the Galtieri moment. We all know that the Argentinian junta in the late 70s and early 80s was really beginning to feel the heat from a collapsing economy. And if it gets to the situation where the Chinese economy is really suffering, then there is a tried and tested method that authoritarian states have taken for years,
Mm,
General Garrett, for example, of invading somewhere to take the domestic heat off. And I think that that is something that we really have to be cognizant of moving forward.
mm,
So here's my challenge to that. I get that, and it's a worry. And look, we're seeing that in different parts of the world, and some people will say that that may be where America goes as well. But there would be nothing more catastrophic for the Chinese economy than to go to war. It would absolutely be cutting off the nose in spite of the face, as it would be to turn off a vastly profitable supply chain to the West and the Western military. It's a catch-22, isn't it? Fine,
No,
they go to war, but they also sink themselves at the same time. So they
but
wouldn't.
they no, they wouldn't sink themselves because
Well,
it what
economically, they got nowhere to sell their rare earths to.
we need to understand that the West is not just one monolithic block. If you look at the world economy, it needs microchips. It needs China. The Western economies absolutely need China for them to produce factories. There are about 800,000 jobs in the UK that rely on the car industry. The car industry itself relies on China and Taiwan. So if we went into conflict with China over Taiwan, and there was a huge issue for about 6 months or a year, if we wanted to restart the car factories, there's only one thing we could do, which is to go back into bed with China. Because we're not going to be able to produce alternatives to the supply chain within the next 6 months or a year. It'll take years and years and years. I really fundamentally don't believe that China would be cutting its nose off to spite its face in the long term. In the short term, yes, but this is why China has also got an advantage because domestically and politically, they can take the pain in the short term more than we
mm,
can. And in fact, they're preparing for short term pain, knowing that the long term relationship between them and the West is such that we still have to go back to them for supply chain and other things if we were to avoid the complete long term collapse. At least in the medium term, till we could rebuild our economies of the global and Western economies.
All right. Sam, you make your argument very powerfully. What I'm really interested in is David Cameron and George Osborne get a terrible hard time these days, don't they, for the golden age moment 10 years or so back when they were doing everything they could to suck up to China. My question is, what could we have done? Because China was the biggest market in the world. It still is. A billion people getting ever richer. If Cameron Osborne and all the other world leaders at the time, the Obamas, etc., turn around to China then and say, look, we're a bit worried about all your rearming. We're not going to want to trade with you. In fact, we're going to close up shop. It could have been even worse.
I think that one of the things that perhaps we fail to recognize is that what we've seen in the US led order since the Second World War has been a particular phase of history underpinned by a specific philosophy. And that philosophy is an American philosophy at heart, which is all about the values of democracy and free speech and an understanding, a belief that the rest of the world wanted to be like America. And I've written actually quite a lot about this and about the importance of understanding American values to the underpinning of the global system. And when I was working in the American Senate in the early 2000s, looking at Chinese trade policy, one of the things that we kept being told was ignore any infractions by the Chinese when it comes to the dumping of metals. Because if we ignore that, then they're more likely to become a democracy. And that means that we can better work together. And there was an understanding in the White House, especially, but also amongst huge amounts of the American and the Western political establishment, that by becoming a democracy, you'd be fulfilling your destiny because that was everyone wanted to be like the West and a liberal democracy, and that would make the world much safer. You might know the McDonald's theory, where which says that no countries with McDonald's have ever been to war. And there's loads of sort of other theories which keep going on about how democracies make the world safer, and maybe and they do. There's lots of evidence that supports that. But it is not to say that the rest of the world wants to be a democracy, or, by the way, that countries with McDonald's have not fought each other. For example, Ukraine and Russia. And I think that it is incredibly hard to say what we could have done differently, because the whole Western world was unbelievably smitten with the liberal philosophy, which underpinned everything. And all our political thinking said that globalization was good. But I do think that now is the time to realize that we've got to make a change if we're not going to welcome in a new Chinese-led order, which is going to be built on very, very different philosophies, which is going to be run very, very differently, and where we will not have a seat at the table. So therefore, that fundamentally, we will be at a disadvantage in the West
Mm.
for the first time in hundreds of years.
Sam, you can't work in the profession of arms or in the sort of areas that you and I worked in for most of our careers without being a student of history. And of course, one of the great texts that many of us draw on is the Peloponnesian Wars by Thucydides, where much of what he's written in there has been synthesized down to this very simple idea of a Thucydides trap, where a rising power which challenges a status quo or a declining status quo power will lead inevitably to war, as there was between Athens and Sparta in the Peloponnesian Wars. And I'm not sure whether that's true or not, but you can certainly see that there is. It feels like there is a drumbeat of assumption of almost inevitability about some form of confrontation. One of the things that you've written that I really like, and you sent me this paper a few weeks ago, was this idea of the Lydian dilemma, where you're drawing on some different classical history. And as part of that, you pointed to the dilemma that the United States face in their confrontation with China. And you also pointed to part of what we've been discussing here today, but you also offered some prescription for what we might do about it. Can you just talk us through some of those ideas?
Yes. So, first of all, I think that the Thucydides trap is a very interesting construct. Even if some people disagree with the premise, and people say he misunderstood Thucydides' analysis, and I don't buy that. I think that the bottom line is that there was a big war between Athens and Sparta, and a big part of that was to do with the values. Athens and Sparta had very, very different values, and the thing is that the one of the I think the differences that played out between the American and British handover versus what we're seeing now with the American and Chinese potential handover is that word values. The American and the British value system is very, very similar. I mean, the Americans push more on democracy and push more on liberal order, and they were very much anti-imperial. But at the end of the day, it was still a value system based on English value system, and I've written lots about this. Go back to the 1630s and 40s, etc. But there is a huge amount of commonality, not least because in late 1800s and early 1900s, there was massive intermarriage between the British and American elites as well. So it was much easier for there to be a consideration that this was
Mhm.
actually a continuation of an Anglo order. And Macmillan said about it very, easily. He basically put it easily by saying that Britain would be the new Greece to America's Rome. What's different between China and America is that there's very, very limited cultural overlap. Hardly anyone in China and really understands the Western political philosophy. I talk about the senior levelers, of course. Hardly anyone in the West really speaks Chinese. I mean, only a few hundred, maybe 1,000 or so people take Chinese GCSE in the UK, right? And the amount of people that really have spent time in China is infinitesimally small. And there is no cultural overlap really to be able to make small talk. And there isn't even an agreement. For example, when American and Chinese politicians meet, they always have an argument as to whether they're meeting the right level. And the reason for that is because Chinese political levels don't easily translate into Western political levels. And so they always have this sort of argument as to am I being slighted by meeting someone too junior or whatever. So this is an issue, and there's loads of things going wrong, especially in the communications. There's no hotline between America and China as
Mm.
there was between the Soviet Union and China. So the issue around communication and cultural difficulties is important. But if you go back to the Lydian dilemma specifically, that's based on a concept which is that the Lydian King Croesus was faced with the Persian Empire coming towards his borders very quickly, and he went to the oracle at Delphi and he said, "Should I go to war?" And the oracle said, "If I go to war, then if you go to war, a great empire will fall." And King Croesus said, "Brilliant. Well, that must be the Persians." So he went to war and soon found out that it was actually him that they were talking about. And I think that is a key issue because the American military establishment, and I spent a lot of time talking to generals around this, tends to think that there is such a superlative in American kit and equipment and their warfighting ability that they would be able to beat the Chinese. And maybe at the tactical level, yes, but at the strategic level, and then when we release our paper, we'll show how the strategic level, I won't go into all the details now, but basically, China outcompetes America strategically, whether it's on economic resilience and the ability to be able to draw on an industrial base and the technological base and domestic political support and so on. There are so many areas where China's got the strategic upper hand. And why that's important is because if the rest of the world sees America really struggling against China, that will be a nail in the coffin, another, maybe a final nail in the coffin of the American-led world order, because 3/4 of the world that exists outside of the West will look at that and say, why would I put my faith in America and in the West when obviously China is the dominant force and the Chinese way is superior to the American/Western way? And I think that at that moment, we would potentially be able to say that that would be the real switch between a US and a Chinese-led order.
So
Mm.
I don't know if I just speak for myself here rather than Patrick, but I'm beginning to get a little bit depressed. Short of putting on a Chinese uniform, learning Mandarin double quick time, and succumbing to the little red book every night before I go to bed, what should we do then to get ourselves out of this, or at least give ourselves a fighting chance?
Well, the most important thing is recognizing that all hope is not lost. The Western world is very, very successful and has been for hundreds and hundreds of years. And a lot of the fundamentals that make us successful are still there. For example, the ability to have free speech and the ability to be able to actually bring together different groups of people and work as a whole to very in a very constructive way. What we need to do is we need to recognize that the rest of the world is changing very quickly. China and Russia are creating a counter alignment where they basically are doing anything they can to undermine the West and to destroy the Western led order. And so much of the rest of the world, including India, has lost faith and lost their ability to really to believe in the American/Western led order. And so we need to get real and realize that the domestic issues that we keep squabbling about, actually, they of course are important. But if we only focus internally and don't focus on the big picture of this changing world order, then we are completely screwed. To pardon my French,
No, no,
because
we accept that term on this podcast.
yeah, because the West just looking internally and not looking at the rest of the world will be betraying the lessons that we've learned for hundreds and hundreds of years, which is that the West lives and exists and its successes exist in the framework of a world, not just the shores of Europe and North America. But if we get that right and we rekindle the ambition to be successful and to bring the rest of the world with us, then we can push back on China. But at the moment, it doesn't look like there is the political will. The stirrings of it, yes, but we need more than stirrings. We need concrete action from our leaders if we're not going to enter into the Chinese-led world order, where, as I said, we do not have a seat at the table, and that will be the hundreds and hundreds of years of detriment to the people that come after us.
Patrick, it was down to you a year ago. It's down to your successor and his like now. Did you not try this? I mean, you were aware, you've said you're aware of the vastly growing threat of China, militarily, supply chains, etc. Did you not ever tell the Prime Minister at the time?
Well, as it happens, Tom, and I think we did. So the collective assessment in the intelligence community and across the defence community in the UK, but also I think across the West, and particularly in the Five Eyes, has been one of absolute recognition of the growing threat and some of our critical vulnerabilities. And when I first took over as a chief, I found myself in number 10 with my co-chiefs just after, or just before, in fact, Prime Minister Johnson Boris had won had just before he won his landslide election, and we were trying to articulate why we thought it was important that we should be countering China and waking up to these vulnerabilities. And the conversation, which had ranged around the world on the various different threats that we face and defenses, readiness, and posture to deal with it, had been very collegiate. Boris was very affable. He was a good listener, very engaged, taking copious notes. But when it came to the discussion on China, his whole body language and demeanor changed. And he got very tight, very uncomfortable, and said, no, 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 no. No, we're not, I'm not prepared to discuss China. We're not going to deal with China. And that, I think, gives you an insight into why we have been slow to address this.
Did he explain to
Because
you why you didn't want to deal with China? Or was it, I mean, look, he's the PM. You're a mere four-star general. What was that
no,
about?
it was one of those Boris reactions where he was just, he was clearly physically uncomfortable. His body language was a reaction of some very, very core held beliefs, because I think he understood, he recognized the extent to which we were economically dependent on China. He'd inherited to an extent the slightly Panglossian Cameron and Osborne view about a golden era. He knew that he had to help grow and sustain the economy. And the sort of things that we were saying that we needed to do were not going to help with that. And so, and I think that still plays through. The fact that the British government still has not published an awful lot of the findings from the China audit, they remain classified, tells you that we have not yet entirely reconciled ourselves to the position that we are going to have to harden ourselves against the sort of threats that Sam has been describing very, very clearly during the course of this episode.
Well, Patrick, I hope Keir Starmer's listening to this, and I would love to be in number 10 now to hear what the current chiefs are saying to him and if his reaction's any different to Boris's. Sam, thank you so much for that. That was a really, really powerful tour de force. I'll have to be honest and say, when I first heard your argument, I wasn't tempted to believe it. I now do. I believe about 95% of it anyway. It really is a wake-up moment. But thank you so much for sharing all that with us in such fascinating and slightly scary detail.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I hope you'll come back, Sam, because we've got plenty more to discuss about China over the coming months.
Always happy to. And China is the story that never stops.
Well, Patrick, that was an unbelievable tour de force. I'm going to have to lie down and think that all through quite carefully because there is some glimmers of hope, but my God, do we need to act quickly. Before we go, though, we want to talk about an email from a listener. Really interesting question, this. I'm going to read it to you and ask for your answer. It's from Joanna. She says this: surely the lack of practical fighting experience is precisely why China is now fighting in Ukraine alongside soldiers from North Korea.
It's a great question. I mean, the key point I think that Joanna brings out here is the linkage between what's going on in Ukraine and the signaling that will send to China around the potential of confrontation. I mean, the safest way of preventing a confrontation in the Indo-Pacific over Taiwan is to make sure that Russia is defeated in Ukraine. I mean, Joanna's not strictly correct in that the Chinese are not fighting inside Ukraine. There have been some reports of Chinese casualties, but I think the way to think about what the Chinese are doing, as opposed to the North Koreans, is that they are sending forward technical advisors for equipment, and sometimes they are going forward into the combat zone where they need to be in order to provide that advice. But essentially, Joanna, you're right. The lessons that China and North Korea are getting from that fighting in Ukraine will help them understand and adapt for any future confrontation they may have with the United States and its allies. And perhaps one way to think about this is that we're engaged in a battle for adaptation. And whether it's us, the West, and NATO and the United States, whether it's Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, the side, if you like, that is able to adapt most quickly to this emerging character of conflicts, in particular the use of autonomous systems and drones and increasingly artificial intelligence, is the one that will go into the next war with a fundamental advantage.
I totally agree with that. Absolutely fascinating. That is about it for today. A big thank you again to our guest, Sam Olsen, and we'll be back next week, of course. But in the meantime, do get in touch with us with any more questions you have or any more points you want to make to us. Email us at generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. That's generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. And we'll look at more in episodes to come, as well as in the Times' War and Peace weekly newsletter, out every Thursday, written by me, yours truly. So until next week, thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Tom.